Good morning. Good morning. This is my last opportunity to address you before you begin your deliberations, and there are a few thoughts that I want to share with you. Now, if you're like me, you've listened to the prosecution's argument throughout the last week or so. You've noticed them present their theory of the case is that my client Beverly was the individual who was in charge of the entire operation. That's why it's necessary for them to continue to paint her as the matriarch, as someone who is in control of everything, that she is a puppet master, that no one does anything unless it's her desire to have it happen and have it done. The reason for this is simply because that is the version of the events that the investigators were given when this case was first beginning to develop many years ago. Before going back to the 2015 time period, it is important to go back to 2002 when all of this started. We heard from the testimony of Chris, and I'm going to get into that a little further, of how he and Deneen met each other, and they met for coffee or whatever at McDonald's, and they found out they had some things in common. And those things in common appear to be murder and lies, because it was on the night of May the 7th of 2002 when those two developed a plan, for whatever reasons, to take the life of Robert Carabello. Now, we know this because we heard Chris McMillan tell you that he actually did enter into a plea and he is guilty of the murder of Robert. And we heard that Deneen was found guilty at the trial in which she actually had on her own behalf. Now, what we heard through the course of all of this, though, when we fast forward into the later years of 2015, we heard how the plan developed. We heard what those two did, and we heard how they pulled Beverly into this entire sordid deal that took place in that basement. And it's important for us to acknowledge how this narrative came to be. The narrative came to be is that once they had taken the life of Robert, they went and got Beverly involved with the disposal of the body itself. Now, the testimony of Chris McMillan, and I'll use Mr. Lloyd's assessment, as you would do with any of the witnesses, is to judge their credibility, judge how they actually are as a witness. We had a chance to observe Chris McMillan in his testimony. You had a chance to look at his demeanor, how he acted, how he responded to questions, both in direct and to cross-examination. And you also had to hear from other witnesses how that testimony comports with what they knew about the case. Now, we heard from him as far as his saying that he actually was part of the plan. But we heard from the detectives that initially, when they began to speak with him, he didn't confess. Detective Malpe said that he was vague on who used the hammer, vague on who drove. We had other witnesses that saw that he actually did offer evidence or offer testimony that was different and distinct. And this happened when he was actually on the stand. He purports that he actually entered a plea of guilty to actually partaking in the taking of the life of Robert, but then you distinctly heard him say that instead of accidentally hitting the post, now he's intentionally hitting the post because he didn't want to harm Robert. The testimony in direct was that there had to be some type of plan that developed. There was some type of meeting that happened and that Beverly was somehow in charge of this planning. But if you listen to his testimony, when he was asked who was the person that came to you first to actually talk to you about taking Robert's life, it was Deneen. He only came up with the Beverly version later. It was Deneen that spoke to him about this. You heard that Robert didn't like Chris for whatever reasons. In hindsight, Robert was right to be concerned and cautious about this. Now, we've heard different timelines, but if we accept Chris's timeline of when he actually met Deneen and when he actually came to live in that house, it was late February, early March. He came to live there. He ate their food. He smoked Robert's marijuana because, as he said, he had good marijuana. He didn't contribute anything to the family unit. late February, early March. And within 2 months, this individual is taking the life of Robert. That is the person whose testimony you're being asked to consider as being truthful and accurate and something that you can hang all your hopes of this case on. That is that individual there. And I want you to take a good long look at Chris McMillan and see if his credibility, if it is all worthy of any type of consideration of being truthful. There's been a lot of discussion about whether Deneen's sexual orientation was known to the family or not, but what we heard from Chris was that in his mind it was not known, and that there were repercussions that would happen. Now, is that in and of itself motive? I don't know. But at some point in time, the idea was there had to be a conversation with Robert about that and about the continued living environment. Now, if that is accurate, and we heard from Chris that seemed to be a concern, then the notion that Beverly, and only Beverly, is in control of that household goes out the window. When I asked Chris about, was Robert an individual with whom you would actually cross or trifle with? No, he knew people. He knew people. So it is certainly some guts that it took from Chris to actually participate in the murder of Robert. You heard about Chris being charged, as he initially was, with open murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and he took a deal to a lesser charge of 15 years. And you heard about the number of interviews he did with the detectives in order to develop the theory, to develop this narrative that he came up with as far as what happened there. It is in his best interest to make sure that that narrative stays true and stays genuine in order for him to be able to actually have gotten that type of a regard in this case. He has a vested interest in the story that he's telling each time. And you'll hear that he actually was the one upon cross about the trip to Jamaica, that he paid for the trip to Jamaica himself. The prosecution suggests that they could stop with Chris, and they have actually developed enough of this theory and the story there. And in some ways, they basically have. Chris is the only person that was down that basement that night that knows what happened, and he pled guilty. The people who murdered Robert Caraballo are already convicted and in jail. Their story only serves to try to bring another person in after the fact. Now, we have the ability to look back. There's no not knowing or not knowing what happened in the entire case. Because then we actually heard about the investigation into Deneen back in 2015. And we heard a little bit from Cicely that tells us that, and it comports with the reaching out to the investigators in 2015. It was in April of 2015. April of 2015, when Deneen reached out with an email about knowing something about a murder happened, and then eventually knowing who might have actually perpetuated that murder. Now, shockingly, it's because she actually was the person that perpetuated the murder itself. So she has this inside information. What would motivate someone to actually come forward in April of 2015 with that type of information? Well, we heard from Cicely that the grandmother had passed away in 2015, and Cicely said that Deneen thought there was some type of inheritance to be had, and that there was no inheritance to be had. That was a triggering point. That was a motive for Deneen to take the step that she did. Whatever the calculation that she actually thought she was going to get away with failed miserably. Although we did hear from Detective Malpe in the consideration that Deneen was someone who thought that she could manipulate her way out of a situation that she happened to be in. Now, considering Cicely and Cicely's testimony, there are, to some degree, very few innocents in this entire story. And our hearts have to go out for Cicely at that young age to be exposed to what she was exposed to. But we have to think about what she was conveying now as a grown woman with her own family, trying to think back on what the memory was as a young girl, 9 years old, living in that household. What her testimony relates to us is in some ways, again, a testimony that destroys, again, the credibility of Chris McMillan. Before I jump ahead there, I guess there was testimony about this being the first time in her life that she recalls of having some stability in her life. She was born in 1993. We heard testimony that Robert had been incarcerated at least up to 1999, early 2000. So she spent a good deal of her life without her father in the role of being a father. And as sad as that is, she actually has done remarkably well in her life to get past that. And the prosecution wants us to just listen to a few things that she said and not the rest of her testimony. Well, the rest of her testimony is very important because Cicely remembers that evening. She remembers it being at night. She remembers being placed in the van. The drive was some distance. She distinctly remembers hearing an explosion. Now, what the explosion was or how severe it was, we don't know, but it was one loud enough to wake her up from her slumber. And she remembers hearing her mother's voice, Beverly McCallum's voice, in the van driving. And she looked out and she saw her sister, Deneen, running from the fire. That is in direct contradiction to what Chris actually testified to as who was driving the van that night and how that all went out. She also talked about the fact that it was past midnight when all this happened. Now, my client had testified that this happened earlier in the evening. Chris had testified this happened in the morning time. How do we compart those two things? If Chris is correct, this happened early in the morning. We had our medical examiner talk about rigor mortis and when that would have set in and how stiff the body would have been. So if the murder of Robert happened in the morning and then the actual putting Robert's body into the trunk in the later evening would have been a great impossibility, because Chris did not say that they just laid on top of the chest, and that the lid didn't quite close. It didn't quite close, which indicates that a good portion of Robert's body had to be in that trunk. Well, the two can't be correct. Either he had to die closer to the time of when he was placed in the trunk, or otherwise Cicely is entirely incorrect. I put to work for you that Cicely is probably one of the more accurate people to have testified during this entire trial. Once again, destroying the credibility of Chris McMillan. The events of that evening are quite chilling. My client testified about an incident that took place on the stairs. She gave a little demonstration, and I think sufficiently explained how this injury would have taken place, the injury that she described to Cicely some years later, of the backwards movement of her arms that made contact with who she later found out was Robert, and damage done to his face. I'll leave it to you to put whatever weight you want to on whether it was a heavy wound, light wound, or anything such as that. But she admitted to that, and then going back upstairs. Now, interestingly, we have a statement from Cicely saying that my client told her it was Deneen and her friends, plural, that finished Robert off, which is contrary to what my client actually testified to. What we do know is that when we heard from the Michigan State Police Laboratory and the other technician as well from the corporation that did the testing, my client's DNA was not found into the evidence that they actually sifted through in the basement. Now, Mr. Lloyd's going to say that obviously the other two defendants' DNA was also not found, but we did have anywhere from 2 to 4 other unknown contributors of DNA found in that basement. There is reasonable doubt to suspect that this other DNA could belong to someone else, unknown to my client, who actually had some role to deal with in the death of Robert. But my client testified that she'd gone back upstairs after numerous attempts, after cooking her food, and to be clear, she said it was orderly. Every day was the same as far as when the kids got up in the morning, when they took their baths, when they got home, when they actually had dinner from 4 and 4:30, getting another bath or a shower in 6 o'clock or so, and then settling in for the rest of the night. And this day was very much similar to the other days themselves. The difference was the ongoing and the long conversation that was going on down in the basement with Robert, Deneen, and Chris. And eventually we did hear the story about the striking of the face and going back to her room and just being there. At some point in time, she remembers Deneen coming to her and asking for help. Now, we can parse back and forth over what was said or how it was said, but it went on for some time with my client saying that Deneen was acting in a crazy manner, was not making a lot of sense. But she was very clear on direct examination that Deneen came back and said, "We killed Robert." What is Beverly to do with that information? Her daughter, her oldest child, has just come to her and told her she killed someone. Not just someone, not just some stranger on the street, but the person that Beverly is considering to be her husband at that point in time. She is shocked. She's trying to process that information. Quite clearly, what she's doing is processing the information of what she's hearing about the death of Robert, and also the information that she's receiving from her daughter that she has committed a crime, a very serious crime. And what is she supposed to do with it? And it's a situation that you cannot take a class in. You cannot read a book. You cannot read a manual to know what you do in an instant. And in a situation like that, how are you going to actually respond to that perfectly and correctly? How she responds to it is not to act. Now, we can judge whether that's the correct response she has or not, but she is slow to act, let's put it in that regard. We don't have a time frame on when we're told that Deneen comes to her again and says, "We have the kids in the van, we need you to drive us somewhere." Okay. The people say, "You're the matriarch of this family. You're in charge of this entire family. Chris has never done anything to you. Just go get the kids out of the van." Well, the information that you've just gathered from your daughter is that we, at least her and Chris, have taken a life. So all of a sudden, this person who you may not have had any problems with for a while now becomes a major threat because they actually have killed someone. Where is your sense and sensibility in judging whether or not you can trust that same person to not harm you or not harm your children? Her concern, my client's concern, was for her children at that point in time. They're already in the van. She didn't put them there. Chris or Deneen put them there for some purpose. "We need you to drive us somewhere." She's driving the van. She tries some stops ahead of time to try to get help with the kids. There's no one available to do that. So she continues on with the direction she's been told by Chris to take. And she testified in direct that during that transit, she finds out that Robert is actually in the van. Again, she's dealing with the thought that Robert is dead. My daughter has actually committed a crime. The body's in the van. We're driving in the middle of nowhere at night. What is going to happen? And they drive and they get to the location she's told to drive to. Now, again, we go back to the testimony of Cicely, which comports that Beverly was driving, Beverly stayed in the van, is what she said. The explosion takes place. At that point in time, it sinks in the finality of, my gosh, the death of Robert must have happened. That must be them disposing of the body. And then we heard a very quiet drive back into Charlotte after that. All the while not knowing what's going to happen when they do return back to the Horatio Street address. What's going to happen to her? What's going to happen to her children? They return home. They try to return to some type of normalcy. The trauma that she's experiencing and trying to process through certainly is going to take a while. It would take a while for anyone to process that through. All the while, she testified that she has either Deneen or Chris there with her all the time. These two people that she knows, from what she was told, killed Robert, are there with her all the time. So she has to come up with a plan. At some point in time, some type of reason and sensibility reemerges, and the plan is she's got to get away. Maybe she gets away. So she takes the kids and goes to Jamaica. She knows an individual there, whatever the nature of the relationship. Whatever the nature of the relationship is with the individual she went down to Jamaica to spend time with, at least it was an escape. It was probably an escape for several different reasons. It was a physical escape and also not having to worry about the crisis that was in front of her. But she's not totally free. Chris goes down to Jamaica with her. He buys his own plane ticket, he said, and he goes down to Jamaica. She's still not free of this entire situation. Now, obviously, months and years go by, and she's free at that point in time. But again, what is she to do? Again, the tragic figure of Cicely comes out. Is it better for her to tell Cicely, a 9-year-old, that, hey, your stepsister, your half-sister just killed your father, and know the trauma that's going to cause, and the result of that is going to be the incarceration of her daughter? You may not like how she handled the situation, and it may not be the correct situation, but it's the situation and the decision that she actually made. The trauma was allowing the sister to believe that her father had abandoned her instead, and that has caused problems with Cicely over the years, although she seems to have done remarkably well and gotten past that and now understands the situation even better. Mere presence of my client in the home that night when 2 other individuals killed someone does not make her guilty of murder. And her actions after the fact, even though some other individual may not take those same actions, can be understood in the context of what she was thinking about in the terms of a mother who was faced with the fact that her daughter committed a crime, her husband had just been killed, or pseudo-husband had just been killed, and how she's going to process that over the next days, hours, days, and weeks. What is the possible reasons that Beverly could have had to kill Robert? Well, the prosecution wants to say that she wanted to run off to Jamaica. She could have done that countless times. During the course of their relationship from 1988 to 2002, Robert had been incarcerated, we heard through testimony, numerous times. She could have left him at any point in time as he was incarcerated. Instead, she chose to move the family wherever he was incarcerated so the kids could be closer to him. So it'd be easier for them to maintain visitations during holidays, birthdays, significant events. That's how she actually handled herself in this relationship. She could have easily just waited for the next time he went to jail and then made that decision. There's no motivation that my client had to actually kill Robert at all. There's motivation for Chris and Deneen to have done so, at least instigated by the discussion about getting out of the house and kicking them out of the house. And if we have some individual, such as Chris, who within 2 months of living there has so little regard as to take the life, I think we have a better understanding of what that individual is that we're dealing with in that situation. In order for my client to be guilty of second-degree murder, the prosecution has to prove, and you're going to have a jury instruction about what these elements are, but that Beverly caused the death of Robert. That is, that Robert died as a result of blunt force trauma and strangulation. My client testified very clearly that even though she struck Robert, that was not the injury that caused his death. We heard from the medical examiner what caused his death. Now, the people want to say that there's no way that she could have been in her room and not heard what was going on down the basement. It just makes it unbelievable. Now, I may give you the fact that having a broken bat might actually make a noise, but we had no other testimony about ever any other noise being made. Even Chris, the only person that we know that was in the basement, did not talk about any noise being made at that point in time. My client's testimony is significantly different than obviously Chris's. Her testimony was that she did not participate in the actions that killed Robert. Secondly, that she intended to kill Robert, intended to do great bodily harm, but not only created a high risk of death or great bodily harm to Robert, in which a death did occur. Again, I put forth to you there's reasonable doubt to believe that she had a participatory role in the actual death of Robert. If we want to compare the two people who's testifying what happened that night, we have only two. We have Chris McMillan, And I think I've done a pretty thorough job talking about where he's coming from, why he's coming from, and what he is saying, and the value of his testimony, which is in low regard, or my client's testimony in comparison. That being the case, reasonable doubt is there of who is telling the truth at least, and that is Beverly. After this event, Beverly moved to Jamaica and then subsequently to Texas and tried to make her life as much as she possibly could. Heard that she does move around quite a bit. This is not the actions of someone who is fearful of the law reaching out to her. She can be looked up and found almost anywhere she went. And again, the traumatic events of that evening may not have been the actions of someone that we would associate with as far as how we would handle the situation, but I think in the context of what she was going through, what she was experiencing, and how she was processing it after the fact, at least give us some insight into why she did what she did. Not that she took the life, but how she reacted after she was told that the life was taken and how she processed that. That is not a reason to find her guilty of a crime. Mere presence is not a reason to find her guilty of a crime. The reasonable doubt is, and the reasonable doubt would bring you to the conclusion of not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. White.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defendant wasn't fearful of the loss. Even though she traveled around the country, she could be found anywhere she went. Except you'll have to figure out what her alias is, because Detective Maltby told you that she had about 5 or 6 of them, depending on where she went. She's been charged as McCallum. You've heard the name Duchesne, which is what her daughter's name was. And if you look at the records that were produced today, it's Magliacetti. There's a couple more out there too. So you really don't have to be scared of the law when you have so many aliases you can produce that you can just move through the system. And you're not worried about the law when, as Cicely told you, the way you get around the law is to skirt in through Mexico whenever you feel it's necessary. Cicely told you about that as well. And the defense was not wrong. We had 2 people who helped kill Robert back on May 7th, 2002. They have both been convicted. As for Chris, here's the thing to remember as you look at all this evidence. Those interviews that he had with Detective Maltby, they were done at his house in Grand Rapids. It wasn't until after that 3rd interview that Detective Maltby had that he actually arrested Chris McMillan. So when they talk about the fact that, oh, well, Chris got this deal, that's why he told the story. No, that story had been told. That story was out there. The reason he was arrested was because everything he told Detective Maltby matched up to all the evidence Detective Donker and Detective Maltby had gathered up for 16 years. And I want you to think about this too. In 2002, Deneen was 21 years old. Chris was 25 years old. The defendant was 42 years old. So when the defense talks about, well, she really didn't know and she was scared of a 21-year-old girl and a 25-year-old boy. But yet she told you, I'm a traveler. I travel all over the world. I've been here, I've been that. This wasn't a scared woman. She definitely wasn't scared of a 21-year-old girl. She wants to portray to you that she had no knowledge and that whatever knowledge she received, it didn't matter and you shouldn't convict her. Ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, how is a 21-year-old girl going to decide on her own that her stepfather just needs to die? And how are these two individuals going to decide on their own how to kill him quietly, and then remove him? Remember, this is a 42-year-old woman who has two other daughters. But now she's scared. Now all of a sudden she has to get in a car because she's in fear for her children. No, she got in a car because she needed to take her husband's dead body away and get rid of it. Because that's how it really was, ladies and gentlemen. She had control of that family. She told you. She traveled around. She went where she wanted. She did what she wanted. But now all of a sudden, Robert was there. We're not going to do this anymore. We're going to have some structure. We're going to be a family. Well, that was going to kill any chance of going to Jamaica to be with her long-term love affair. So he had to go. And as she told you, her statements, our family takes care of it ourselves. We don't go outside the family. We take care of our problems. And that's what she did. So they're right. 2 people are in prison for the crimes they committed. But that's not the end. There's a third. There's this third person. The 42-year-old mother who was tired of listening to Cicely's dad, who didn't want to change her ways. Think about it. You heard the testimony. You got to see the witnesses. You can compare the evidence. What makes sense? The one thing I asked you in the very beginning of this case to keep, your common sense. This 42-year-old traveling woman wanted to continue her life. And that wasn't going to happen if Robert was around or if Robert got tired of it and decided to take his daughter. See, she needed her daughters because that was how she continued her criminal life. Cicely told you. Listen to the testimony. Look at the evidence. On May 7, 2002, the defendant was part of 3 individuals who talked about a plan, who went over a plan, who executed a plan, and executed Robert. And then after killing Robert at 334 Horatio here in the city of Charlotte, they placed him in that trunk. And that trunk, remember, they tried to bring up the rigor mortis. What did Chris tell you? They killed him in the morning. That trunk was taken down. They cleaned up downstairs, and it wasn't till later on in the evening that he went down there. And when he went down there, Robert was already in that trunk. So when you want to talk about rigor mortis sitting in, if you've taken a fresh dead person and placed them in the trunk, whatever that rigor mortis is going to be the position they were found in. The testimony's there, the evidence is there. They killed him, they carried him away in a trunk, and left Gordon to have to remember the event of May 8, 2002 for the next 22 years. They took Robert's body, they poured gasoline all over it, and they lit him on fire. The defendant is guilty of murder, and she's guilty of burning Robert's body. It's time, ladies and gentlemen. Find her guilty. Thank you.